So now I introduce the last speaker of this symposium. Our next speaker is Roland Fleming from Giessen, University of Giessen. He is, as you already all of you know, he has also, we invited him to another symposium 2 years ago. He's a very active psychophysicist working on Shitsukan perception. And I think also he's the catalyst, working as catalyst between the field of psychophysics and also information technology. So please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to this superb meeting. It's been really, really great. Every talk and every poster has been absolutely fantastic. I've really enjoyed meeting new people and everything as well. So anyway, I'm going to talk about internal models in material perception. And for those of you who were here a few years ago, if you can remember anything at all from my previous talk, I'm hoping that this is going to bring some kind of new ideas to what I was saying back then, a new perspective on how we should think about material perception in general. Now, I use a lot of computer graphics in my research, and I always like to start with a really kind of sexy-looking image. So today I'm going to start off with this. It's a line and a dot. Now, this may look like it's a long way away from material perception, but actually this comes from a study that was conducted quite a few years ago by Jacob Feltman, and I've become really obsessed by this really exciting experiment. It doesn't sound like an exciting experiment, but I think that you'll see over the course of this talk that I think that the insights that you can gain from this experiment that I'll explain in a moment have really profound and far-reaching implications for how we think about material perception, what the key questions in material perception are. So what he did was he showed subjects this stimulus, and he just said, draw me other examples of this stimulus. And what they did not draw were pictures of shoes or toilets or a circle or a hexagon. What they drew were lines of different lengths and different orientations with a dot placed on the line, okay? And I'll talk in a little bit about his theoretical interpretation of what this result means, because it's going to be very relevant for building the theoretical ideas that I want to present to you. But I just want to start off with this basic observation. So given a single exemplar, the experimental subjects had some intuition, some idea of what other versions of the object might look like. They were able to predict in a very systematic way from a single exemplar what category or what class or concept was trying to be expressed with this single exemplar. And I think that this is actually quite a nice way of thinking about one of the core problems in material perception. So given an image of an object which has a certain material appearance, you can think of material perception as answering the question, how else might it look next time I see it? So the reason that this is, so for example, it might look like this the next time you see it, okay? And what we could think of material perception as being is the process of representing the way that this material will appear to me in other situations when I come across it, okay? And the reason that this is a non-trivial thing to do, as we've heard numerous times throughout this conference, is because the image, a given image, is obviously a complex combination of multiple factors. So lighting, reflectance, shape, viewpoint, all come together. And so rendering is this process of combining many factors. And we have this intuitive idea that in order to be able to predict the future appearance of an image, of a particular object, you somehow have to decouple these different factors from one another. And just giving a concrete example, here's a mirrored sphere. Obviously, a mirrored sphere is nothing more than an image of the world surrounding that object. So you take it, put it in a new situation, and you can end up with a very, very different image. So identical materials can lead to very different images. And we also heard about this in the context of object recognition, where pose or position or lighting or all of these different things can affect it. And conversely, these two images are very different from one another. It turns out on a pixel-by-pixel basis, this image is more similar to that one than it is to that one. And this image is more similar to that one than it is to that one. So different materials can lead to very similar images. And this is the kind of key problem that makes material perception difficult, makes predicting the future appearance of materials difficult, right? Now, broadly speaking, in the field, there have been two major ways of thinking about how you could go about solving this. And I think this maps on in some ways to what we heard earlier on in the computer vision session, where both approaches do yield some kind of useful results. Okay, so one possibility is that you try to develop a deep representation, a physical model, and this is what's usually called inverse optics, where you explicitly estimate and discount the contribution of illumination or other factors to the observed image intensities. And the key aspect of this that I think makes it distinct from the other approach is an explicit physical model of the scene is what you're trying to develop. Now, there are some technical challenges that you have to resolve if you're going to try and do this. The key one being the chicken and egg problem, which is that if you want to work out the shape, you need to know the reflectance and the illumination. If you want to work out the illumination, you need to know the reflectance and the shape, and so on. As we saw earlier, you have to provide some kind of assumptions or constraints on one factor in order to be able to work out the others. Okay, so yeah, so this idea is related to intrinsic image analysis or inverse optics, the idea that you explicitly separate out these factors in the process of perception. So you can think of material perception in this context as solving this problem, as taking the image and splitting it up into these factors. And this is an old idea. This goes back at least as far as the Gestalt psychologists who talked about scission, this idea of separating single image intensities into multiple distinct causes. Okay, now that's one tradition. Another tradition which has developed is a much more heuristic approach, a utilitarian approach, where people say, okay, this chicken and egg problem, that sounds really complicated to me. I'm not even going to try and solve that. What I'm going to do is do something statistical, something image-based. What I'm going to try and do is identify simple image properties that correlate with surface reflectance or other surface properties that we're interested in estimating. And in this in the extreme version of this, the straw man version that I'm going to knock down throughout the rest of this talk, there's no explicit representation of the properties of surfaces or anything else in the scene. It's just a bunch of hacks. And this has advantages, is computationally simple, but it also will sometimes get things wrong. And that can be quite interesting because if the pattern of errors matches the pattern of errors produced by humans, then that's actually a good way of testing the model. And I think that's along the same lines as what Jim was arguing just now. Anyway, so I'm just going to put flesh on the bones when it comes to this heuristics approach. This is certainly the way that I have been thinking about material perception for many years, although there's been a recent change in my way of thinking about material perception, which is what I'm going to try to convince you of today. But in order to knock it down, I have to set it up first. So here's the basic logic. Suppose you're confronted with this image here. It's cropped out from its surroundings, so you have no additional information about the illumination. And what I would argue is the brain has learned a kind of heuristic association. It says, here's a blurry feature in the image. There's two kinds of interpretations you could have. It could be a sharp reflection of a blurry world, or it could be a blurry reflection of an inherently sharp world. And the visual system can then bring to bear some kind of statistical assumption. The world usually isn't blurry. Therefore, it's probably the reflection that's blurry, and this is why these kinds of features can map in a very transparent way onto interpretations of surface properties. So you just have to have this heuristic. If it's blurry, it's probably due to the reflectance, right? And we'd shown in these old experiments, or we argued that humans exploit statistical regularities of real-world illumination in order to eliminate unlikely interpretations in this kind of way. This is old stuff. Probably a few people in this room are familiar with this, but I just want to briefly mention it because it allows me to make another point that connects to more recent work by Bart and other people. Okay, so what we did in these experiments is we had two objects, two spheres. They were illuminated under different illumination conditions, and the subject had to adjust the reflectance properties of the match until it appeared to be made out of the same material as the test image. Crucially, they were illuminated under different illuminations, so it's an asymmetric matching task, and their task is to try to match the reflectance while ignoring the difference between the illuminations. And I'm not going to go through the results, I'm just going to give you the take-home message from this. What we find was that subjects are good at matching the reflectance properties across real-world illuminations, suggesting they have some degree of gloss constancy, whereas they were much worse under illumination conditions where the statistics of the illumination were not typical of the real world. Okay, but what's relevant for what I'm going to say now is one of the key findings was that the illumination affects the estimation of glossiness. So there is a contamination of one of the factors of the scene, the illumination, on your ability to estimate the glossiness, which is the reflectance properties of the surface. Now, in some ways, that's not that surprising because we've just talked about how there's this ambiguity between the two, so maybe it's not that surprising. But in the literature, over the years, there have developed a series of somewhat weirder contamination results, where, for example, Ho et al. Measured perceived glossiness of surfaces with different bumpy reliefs. And they found a contamination of the bumpiness of the surface on the perceived glossiness of the surface. And this is kind of a weird thing. I mean, why would you mistake the bumpiness of a surface for the glossiness, or vice versa? They're two completely different properties of the object. This led, wanting to understand this, led to this very, very nice study by, from Bart's lab. And we've already seen this figure, but I'm just going to show it again and briefly point out, because I think it sets up the logic of what I want to argue afterwards. So what they point out here is, here's a bunch of different reliefs. So there's a shallow relief and a deep relief, and it's illuminated under two different illumination conditions, so oblique illumination and frontal illumination. And depending on the particular configuration of the illumination and the relief, what you end up with is different kinds of highlights in the image, right? So the size, the contrast, the distinctiveness of the highlight is very strongly affected by these factors other than the reflectance properties of the surface. So here's the kind of hypothesis that I want to start developing, that when we talk about perceiving or estimating glossiness, the brain is not actually estimating surface reflectance at all. What it's doing is using the extent of manifesting highlights as a proxy. And this is the kind of argument that Bart was making. And I think that if you take this line, you can develop it quite a lot further. And actually, I would disagree with the conclusion that you should end up with inverse optics. I'm going to argue for a slightly different way of thinking about it. Okay, so what does gloss estimation really mean? What it means is not actually estimating physical properties of the world. So this is quite a strong philosophical claim. I'm saying that you don't see the world. What you see is, or what I'm going to argue, is that you estimate statistically important appearance attributes. So that is characteristics in the image, observable, easily measured characteristics in the image that are related to or structured by the physical laws that created the image. So you're not estimating physical parameters, and you're not just using heuristics. You're building a model that explains the structure that is observed in images. That structure arises from the physics of the world, but is not a direct representation of the physics of the world. Okay? And actually, if you I think that if you think about material perception in this way, it allows you to make sense of these seemingly inconsistent and sometimes baffling effects of one factor on another factor in a much more rational and coherent way. So once again, just to put this again, what I would argue is that the brain creates a statistical model which describes the natural degrees of variation between the samples that you might encounter, expressed in the basis of, or expressed in terms of, easily measured appearance attributes, so the stuff that you're seeing in the image. So it's basically saying, oh, I see the surface, I find the highlight, I'm going to try and build a statistical model of how highlights tend to behave under different conditions. And it's this statistical model that is what I think we mean when we talk about perceiving a property like glossiness. So yeah, you find the highlights and you work out that as you change this thing in the world, which you never actually really estimate, which is the specular reflectance, it has this very systematic effect on the properties of the highlights. And so that's why you learn that highlights are the thing to use or perceive. Okay, now this is an idea that you have a model, a deep model in your mind, which allows you to represent the statistical structure of the world. And I was very taken with Giessen when I was younger, and this put me off the idea of internal models in perception for a long time. But I'm perfectly willing, or I was perfectly willing, to accept the idea of generative models in other domains, in cognition and behavior. So I just want to point out some circumstances where this happens. So, for example, generative grammars in language processing, this is the idea that you have a compact representation that can embody all legal possible sentences. Okay, so you can predict and it's prescriptive. It generates new exemplars, so it's predictive in this way. And the rules are learned, and they let you disambiguate, so as you apply it, the same surface structure, so the same proximal stimulus, depending on the nature of the inferred hidden structure, gives you actually a different interpretation of what that stimulus means. So this, I think, is one interesting characteristic of internal models. We also find internal models in motor control. So for example, in models of the cerebellum, there's this idea that you have a forwards model of your own effector, and you're predicting, constantly predicting, the sensory feedback that you expect to result from your action. And it's this predicted feedback, the mismatch between the predicted feedback and the actual feedback, that allows you to hone the model over time. So this is a forward model, a deep model, and one that captures the natural degrees of freedom of the effector. So this idea of capturing natural degrees of freedom in the domain that you're trying to model is, I think, another key characteristic of what these models should do. Okay, so natural degrees of variation. How could you go about actually computing this? Suppose you start off with an input image. The basic idea is you have some kind of prediction. How else might this look next time I see it, right? But then the big question, and this is a question that comes up whenever you have Bayesian models, is, well, where on earth did the hypotheses come from? Okay, you've got to be able to tell the difference. You want to say this is a plausible and this is an implausible outcome or prediction of what the future state might be. And I think that the origin of the hypotheses is perceptual organization principles. And this is where we come back to this experiment by Jacob Feldman. So why do subjects draw a dot on the line with the line at a random orientation and the dot not at the end of the line? He argues that it's based on, so these examples, these legal variants, they have this specific characteristic. He argues that it's based on the geometry that constrains your hypotheses about what the likely causes are, what the generative process that is the origin of the observed image. So put it this way. It could be, the default model should be, that things are caused by a random process unless there is evidence against randomness, okay? Now, the fact that the dot falls on the line, in other words, that it has a codimensionality with the line, indicates that there is almost certainly not a random process at work relating the position of the dot and the line, because the chance of the dot falling on the line by chance in the one observation that you see is small, whereas if there is a generative process that places the dot on the line, the chance of observing the dot on the line is high, right? So this codimensionality indicates that there is probably a generative process at work that placed the dot on the line. Therefore, legal variance should also place the dot on the line. Why does it not put the dot at the end of the line? Because in the exemplar that you saw, the dot is not at the end of the line. If you are shown one that has a dot on the end of the line, because of the codimensionality of this, you would produce the prediction is you would produce exemplars where the dot is always on the end of the line. So going from a single exemplar, you can actually make inferences based on perceptual organization principles that allow you to make hypotheses about the generative structure that is underlying that. Yeah, so non-generic relationships between parts, so symmetries, alignment, and so on, can indicate that something is caused by a generative process rather than by chance. Okay, so how else might it look next time I see it? The idea is that our perceptual organization processes provide some initial hypotheses. So for example, you could parse the image into salient regions, and then identify key characteristics of those salient regions, and those provide initial hypotheses for what might be likely variants of that image. So for example, you parse the image into this region, you find what sticks out in this image. Well, the highlight sticks out because it's quite different from its surroundings. What are the characteristics of the highlight? It has a certain shape, it's brighter than its surrounding, it's less saturated than its surrounding. Okay, if that's the case, then plausible legal variants of this image might include things where the highlight is brighter or bigger or darker or more saturated. These are a set of hypotheses, and they can be then tested against evidence as you get new images coming in. So basically what I'm trying to say is that I'm trying to develop a theory of how you could come up with a model that comes from a single exemplar and then update that with additional evidence in a way that is much less evidence hungry than traditional machine learning algorithms, which often require tens or hundreds of thousands of training images, right? Okay, now obviously there's a lot more to material perception than just the optical properties of surfaces. I've just been talking about reflectance, but I'm going to show you a quick study. Maybe some of you have already seen this. I apologize to those of you who are familiar with this. I hope it's interesting for those who have not seen it. I'm going to talk about other sources of information that also drive material perception. In particular, I'm going to focus on how different materials responding to their intrinsic, as a consequence of their intrinsic mechanics, tend to adopt specific three-dimensional shapes. We know that this must be acute to material because sculptors exploit this when they're trying to depict materials. This is one big block of marble, but Michelangelo, through his skill and talent, is able to depict a wide variety of different materials, including the skin, different types of textile. In fact, if you look when you first look at it, you might not notice this, but if you look carefully, you'll see that he's able to distinguish between different kinds of textile within a single block of marble, just by the way that he shapes it into specific characteristic curves. Okay, so shape as acute to material. This has a similar kind of ambiguity or logic to it as we had earlier on with reflectance and illumination. The physical material properties of the textile determine how they respond to external forces, causing them to self-organize into characteristic shapes. But, of course, a given material can take on many different shapes depending on the specific set of forces or processes to which it is subjected. So how does the visual system learn to recognize that they're the same material? How does it summarize the characteristics that are in common between these different samples of silk? And the particular case that I'm going to focus on now is actually the perception of viscosity in liquids, which is probably the most important difference between different liquids when it comes to their shape and the way that they behave in response to forces. And viscosity ranges from things like kind of water through milk, to higher viscosity materials like this melted chocolate, and I'll show you some examples in a moment. So one of the key questions is how do we visually distinguish between fluids with different viscosities? Here's some animations, physical simulations that we're using in order to study this. Here's an example of a runny liquid, so low viscosity liquid. Here's an example of a medium viscosity liquid. You can see how that oozes out. And here's an example, oh, is it going to load? Okay, here's an example of a much thicker liquid, and that kind of oozes. There is this strange thing that I don't know exactly why. It's a fascinating separate question. Why is it fun to look at this goopy stuff? I don't really understand it, but it always raises a smile. Anyway, so in other work from Shinya Nishida's lab, there's lots of very, very exciting studies that investigate the motion cues that you get from the characteristics ways that the fluid moves. But what I want to focus on today is this quite striking observation that even in a static snapshot, as I'm showing here, you get quite a vivid impression of the properties of the material. So the way that the stuff runs and spreads out in one case versus the way that it clumps up into distinctive piles is telling you something about the viscosity of the liquid in quite a vivid way. Okay, so one of the first questions you can ask is what is the perceptual scale of viscosity? So if you vary the physical viscosity, how does the perceived viscosity vary as a function of that? And I'm going to try to use that as a way to test a model of viscosity perception. And the way that we're going to measure this psychophysically is using maximum likelihood difference scaling, which is an established technique for making suprathreshold psychophysical scalings, which has been applied to many, many different domains. Basically, what you do is you have a bunch of, in each trial, you're shown two pairs of stimuli, and you just have to say how different, so in which pair is the difference between the two stimuli bigger? And if you do this for all possible pairs, you crank it through some equations that Larry Maloney and Yang developed, and this allows you to work out what the maximum likelihood difference scale should look like. And we're going to do this with 7 different values of kinematic viscosity and 14 different time points from across the movie sequence. So this is what a typical trial looks like. You can see that it's actually not that easy a task. At first, you're a bit overwhelmed with this 4 different images, but after you've done a few of these, it gets easier to tell the difference, and you can start saying, oh, actually, I think probably, in this case, it's probably the one on the right has a bigger difference than the one on the left. And then so you press B and go on to the next trial, or in this case, it looks like it's the one on the left, and then you go on to the next trial, and so on. Okay, so you do this for all of the different things, and you can measure the psychophysical scale. Here are the scales for all of the individual subjects. The thick green line is the mean across those subjects. One interesting observation here is that there seems to be something like a kind of perceptual phase transition between, on the left-hand side, runny liquids, which are all kind of much of a muchness, and then there's a sudden transition up to much thicker liquids, which are the thick, clumpy stuff. So yeah, there's kind of splashy, runny stuff on one side, clumpy stuff on the other side, and then the obvious question that comes out of this is, well, which cues are they using in order to perform this task? What is it about the images? What is it about the shape of these materials that causes this particular psychometric function to come out of the scaling method? Okay, so to investigate this, what we did was start off with just some really basic intuitions by looking at the images and trying to then proceduralize the intuitions that we find. So if you look at the low viscosity image, you'll say, well, there's a whole bunch of things that it does. It's smoother, straighter, flatter, narrower, lower, whereas the high viscosity one is wavier, curvier, rounder, fatter, taller. So this suggests that what we're going to need is more than just a single image statistic, but maybe a bunch of image statistics. And so we decided to do this in a purely 2D domain and just see how far we can get by taking alpha mats of the images. This is relatively easy to compute, makes the analysis very simple. And we'll just see how far we can get in predicting the human psychophysical performance based on these kinds of cues. So we've got these very simple 2D shaped cues, and we're going to look for correlations with viscosity. In practice, we had 26 different properties, but what I'm going to show you is a parameter-free model in the sense that there is absolutely no fitting to the data. We just measure what the cues do, measure how variable each cue is, and then take a weighted linear sum of those, which means that there may be, or there almost certainly is, a better linear combination for fitting the data, but we're taking a parameter-free approach where we're not going to try and do any fitting. We're just going to say, let's weight them by how intrinsically reliable each of these cues are and see how well it can predict the results. So here's one example of one of the cues we used, center of mass. You can see, obviously, the one on the left, the low viscosity fluid, has a lower center of mass than the one on the right. So the vertical component at the center of the mass is a sort of proxy for measuring the extent to which the liquid settles under gravity versus piles up. In practice, this is how the center of mass varies as a function of the time. And you can see this is for the lowest viscosity fluid. And what we're going to do is take the Euclidean distance between the different values to create a prediction of what the perceived differences in viscosity are. So it's the difference in the values predicts the difference in perception. That's what we're hoping to do. So this is the lowest viscosity, so we're going to anchor that to 0, and then measure the other ones relative to that. So for the next viscosity, there's hardly any difference, which predicts a very small difference in perception, and then you can gradually increase the viscosity. Then actually you find that it starts to ramp up a little bit, and then towards the end it starts shallowing off again. When you get to the highest viscosity ones. So this makes a prediction from a single cue, which could be compared to the psychophysics in some way. And then we can do that for other cues. For example, we look at the curvature. So what's the median curvature around the shape? This is meant to be a way of describing the kind of overall degree of bumpiness or curviness that you get in the silhouette of the objects. This is a much noisier statistic, but again, it's the Euclidean distance between the values for the different viscosities that is what we think is the relevant parameter. This one produces a different kind of prediction curve. You can do this with other things. So the compactness, it seems that lower viscosity liquids tend to spread out more, whereas high viscosity liquids tend to remain relatively compact. So we can just measure this with a very simple compactness measure, and again, derive this, and you end up with a prediction that comes out of that. Okay, now, the way that we combine all the 26 factors is that, like I said, we weight each feature according to its variance, so how much is the total range that it varies, and then do PCA on all of the factors, and I'm just plotting the first two principal components of this. So this is the movies in these 26-dimensional space compressed down into a 2-dimensional space, and what you can see is that the structure of the perception is reflecting the structure in the images, in the sense that all the low viscosity stuff is kind of clumped together in this space, and the high viscosity stuff is behaving in a different way, right? And so that actually turns out to predict the subject's data extremely well. Here's the subject's data, and here's this low parameter model, and we find that there's a very strong correlation, a 0 parameter model using these simple cues, and we find there's a very strong correlation between the model and the perception. Now, I want to kind of zoom back out. I'm going to draw some conclusions here and then try and connect this back to what I was saying earlier. Okay, so humans readily distinguish between fluids with different viscosities, both in static and in moving images, although I only talked about the static stuff today. For the static stimuli, there appear to be these kind of two main phases. There's stuff that flows, splashes, and settles versus the stuff that clumps up. And this is directly predicted from the structure of the similarities if you measure properties of shape in the image. And my argument is not that the visual system uses these particular set of measurements, but rather there exists a large number of measurements that will behave in this kind of way. So, putting this back in context, in some sense, this is consistent with the use of heuristics. So we talked about heuristics like the blurriness of the edge of a highlight, or using these very simple shape cues. But at the same time, we seem to be extremely good at spontaneously identifying systematic relationships between the samples. Because one of the key parts of the model that we did was I said, you have to weight each cue by its variance. Okay? So somehow, the visual system has worked out, as I change the viscosities, this cue varies by this amount in this way, whereas this other cue varies by a different amount. And this process of working out what the normalization constant is a process that must be driven by some internal expectations about how reliable or how informative each particular potential cue could be when you're trying to work out what the material properties are. So again, I think that this is actually consistent with the idea of a statistical model which describes these degrees of variation between samples in terms of easily measured appearance properties. So the kind of process model that I'm thinking of, if we wanted to build a kind of computer vision system, would go something along the lines of this. If you're given an image set, potentially a very small image set, right? Maybe even just a single image or only a few images. We have, after this, some general purpose low and mid-level image measurements, the kinds of things that everybody knows take place in V1, V2, so on. And then a key part of understanding materials or extracting the statistical model is some process of nonlinear dimensionality reduction, which allows you to find systematic statistical structure that relates samples to one another in this general purpose feature space that you have. Because the laws of physics will not map on directly to this feature set, but they will impose low-order dimensionality structure in that higher dimensional space. And so the output of performing these kinds of nonlinear dimensionality reductions will be a parametric statistical appearance model that lets you predict the appearance of materials that you've never seen before, if you've understood if you've derived the correct intuitions from your previous experience. So, for example, suppose this is a space with a bunch of features, right? Could be orientations, or colors, or contrasts, or something like that. These different samples that you're exposed to occupy a sparse set within that space. If you were to see the true class distribution of all possible materials, they would create some kind of manifold within this space. And what I'm suggesting is that if you're shown a single exemplar, then you use perceptual organization principles to identify candidate hypotheses about what variations might occur. So, for example, you might parse this image and say, maybe a plausible variation would be that this material is going to spread out in this direction, right? And given that hypothesis, it allows you to cast within the appearance space a hypothesis about what the class of legal variants might look like were you then to be exposed to them, right? So this is just a hypothesis. This is your first guess based on a single image plus some perceptual organization principles. And of course, you can then update that in response to, or in the light of new evidence that you gain as you start to see the object evolve over time, or as you get to see different samples of the material under different circumstances. So you're refining your model over time. So I started off by saying that there were these kind of two broad classes of approaches to thinking about material perception. What I'm trying to say is that there's something kind of in between that might be the right way of thinking about things. So it has the simplicity of heuristics, it's based on the image quantities, but it has some of the depth of a physical model in the sense that it's trying to generatively understand the statistical structure that's observed in the image. And I call this way of thinking about things, statistical appearance models. And in other research, which I haven't had a chance to talk about today, I find that this is an extremely powerful idea for thinking about shape representation and not just material perception in general. Okay, so here are some conclusions. Many effects in material perception are well explained through the use of heuristics based on simple image measurements. At the same time, we have this fascinating ability to identify very easily and quickly commonalities between exemplars and imagine what legal variants of those objects might look like. And so I'm arguing that the visual system builds statistical appearance models that describe the natural degrees of variation between samples and are expressed in terms of constellations of simple, easily measured image quantities. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, but
so I really like this idea conceptually and sort of believe in it in an a priori way. So I wonder if there's a problem with this particular task that you might have to defend against. That is that you're asking people, if I understand the task right, to say which of two pairs is more different. And is it possible that more different in viscosity, but is it possible that people got lazy and just started looking at, well, which is more different, which is a more different image, which would then predict all the results you're getting and maybe not say anything about basis of
absolutely. And in fact, we have subsequent data, which I haven't had a chance to present to you, where we ask the harder question, which is to what degree of invariance do you have, for example, over time? If I show you this liquid at the beginning compared to this liquid at the end of the animation versus another liquid at different points in time, then you've got this disambiguation problem, because obviously liquids at the beginning are all similar to one another, more similar to one another than they are to themselves much later in time. And we find that a model based on these image statistics does not perform in the same way as humans do in that context, suggesting that there is something that is, they're really focusing on the image properties. But the thing is that if the performance is so sensitive to the specific task, it suggests what they don't have is a deep representation of viscosity that they rely on spontaneously, but rather the specific solution that they come up with is one where they're ad hoc trying to second guess, well, what is it the experimenter's asking me for? And this I think is consistent with the broader idea that they're trying to work out what are the statistical regularities within the context of the task that they're trying to perform, right?
I really love the first half of your talk. Can you go back a few slides to your generative model picture with the arrows on it? Because I think it kind of picks out what the,
this one?
73.
This one?
Yeah, because it might not surprise you that the part of that I didn't like is the
miracle happened.
This is the miracle, because the way you've drawn those arrows is actually three-dimensional, right? You're invoking a three-dimensional representation. And I think that my main concern is that the easily measurable quantities that you're talking about, and you're just measuring the boundary contours, aren't going to be stable to changes like viewpoint, aren't going to be stable to changes in scale. And to the extent that perception is probably the wrong way to think about what the generative constraints are. When I looked at those fluids, I mostly was making those judgments based on my three-dimensional experience.
For sure. And please don't please don't understand me as saying because we were able to do some stuff with 2D that I think 2D is sufficient. That was not at all my claim that 2D is sufficient in general. And when I say easily measured, what I mean is, maybe easily sounds easier than I really mean. I mean all of the apparatus of low and mid-level vision. So there's a lot of structure that is getting represented, but it's general purpose rather than being an estimate of physical parameters. That I think is the key distinction that I'm trying to make. So when I talk about easily measured, it still takes millions of neurons to do this, right? It's not, so that was actually not what I thought you were going to pick me out on something even harder than that. Which
I will later.
Yeah.
I did want to make one other comment, which is about generative models,
right.
and that you believe in some, like in language, you use as an example.
Right.
The difference is that language doesn't have to be about the world in the same way that perception has to be.
No,
right?
that's not true. I disagree. So each individual has to learn language from examples of spoken language, right? So the fact that it's created by other people is, I mean, the thing is that
But it can communicate.
the origin of the statistical structure is rule-based, is systematic. That's the only thing that matters. The fact that something is man-made or physical or, I mean, for me, it's completely irrelevant. The only thing is that there is a deep process that is responsible for the statistical structure that's observed in the set of patterns.
That's the sense in which they're the same.
In the
there
same
are
way,
senses in which they're different. I'm not gonna, we can talk about that
there are some key differences, but I think that when it comes to the idea that you're meant to find you can infer a generative model from observations of outputs of that generative model is totally standard and accepted within language understanding. The idea that this could be you know, a revolutionary idea would be just laughable in that context. And so it shouldn't be laughable in the context of vision either.
So I guess in the first part, if I understand it correctly, you were arguing that human vision relies on priors in the combined space of the physical ingredients rather than first decoupling them and relying on the priors on each of the individual ingredients, like geometry, reflectance, and illumination, which I think is a compelling argument to explain the things that human vision cannot do, but computer vision can actually do. But I think there has to be some level of decoupling, because when you show the simple example of using highlights as a cue to understand, you have to tell that that's actually a highlight, right? And for that, you need to know that there is some smooth geometry underlying it.
Yeah, so a generative model is one that should have elements that are combined to explain the observed data. And I think that the ability to parse different causes is the result of applying a statistical generative model, because in actual fact, if you look at lots and lots of samples of objects, the highlight will be moving around in ways that is independent of the shading component, so that you will learn that there's this thing that happens, which turns out to be specular reflection, and there's this other thing that happens, which turns out to be diffuse reflection. And so in that particular case, where for example, they're quite separable, your statistical appearance model will look quite a lot like you're doing a physical decomposition. But there will be other cases where there's no correlation-based way of separating out the causes across observations, where you won't separate them. So for example, in the talk that I'm going to give in APCV, I'm going to be arguing that basically shadows that collect in deep concavities are not separated from reflectance changes, because they always correlate with one another, in the sense that if something is always dark, then it doesn't really matter if it's due to reflectance or illumination. So it's not separating things in terms of this physical properties, but rather in terms of whether they're variable or intrinsic to the object that you're looking at. Right? So I think that I don't think that there's an inconsistency between the idea of separating things into causes. The inconsistency is along which dimension do you choose to separate things? Is it physics, according to what some physics textbooks or optics book would tell you is the right way to parse things, or based on the statistical regularities in observed images over time? Right?
I'm not sure I understand your model, but for example, you know, we are very insensitive to the difference in the specular reflected component, so that it's quite unlikely that we can generate the other, you know, the reflected image. You know, for example, you know, there is a poster there that, you know, if the people has to judge the you know, the matching between the reflected pattern, they cannot tell. You know, so basically we just ignore the details. So probably the important aspect of generative model is that you need to somehow generate it. But I think that we just extract the heuristic you call is, you know, image statistics is just extract, you know, without you know, looking at the detail, the difference. So I think at least for the you know, material, you know, reflectance case and a specular highlight case, I think that it's very difficult to predict what would happen next or other situation. Just, you know, finding out a sort of common information. That's my seems to be
I think that's true, and maybe I somewhat over-egged the pudding. I exaggerated this importance of prediction. The point I was trying to make was a connection to the idea that generative models can allow you to make predictions. It may well be true that we're not very good at making predictions, but I think that there is some intuitive sense that suppose you're learning to recognize a new material, and I show you one image of that material under one circumstance. I think that you very quickly, based on your previous experience, can say, this feature in the image that I've seen, if that were to occur somewhere else in the image with a different orientation and a different kind of position or with a slightly different color, it would be reasonable to expect. I have certain expectations about what is likely and what is unlikely, whereas other features that don't resemble any of the statistical content of the image would be really surprising if all of a sudden, when you show me a new image, they appear. And so that's the idea that I'm trying to get at, rather than that we have. I'm not trying to suggest analysis by synthesis, where we have a little model in our mind and we can predict the future in this more detailed sense.
So directly linking to this, your answer. I have the big problem of like figuring out what's the process of identifying which features here are relevant, or like what is the generative structure. I mean, this sounds like a really, really deep reasoning and figuring out the causes of what's happening there. I mean, is that a learning process you envision that's actually happening, or is that, I mean, just some by chance, like seeing, okay, these kind of like statistics and orientations and stuff like that are happening. I've seen these and these things not appearing, therefore it must be these things.
I don't have a good answer to that. In fact, I think that answering that question is the main goal of the research program going forward. This is more like a manifesto than it is a kind of summary of results. What I would say is that there is an element to which learning is not just a brute force process of acquiring information about individual samples, but is also a bootstrapping process by which you obtain not just information about the samples you've learned, but you obtain hypotheses about what are plausible variations of new samples that you encounter. And I think that this is a very important aspect of learning. And many learning processes that occur, particularly in adults, cannot be explained by traditional learning models because the learning happens far too quickly. And so models that involve some kind of generative process or inference of generative process seem to be much better at explaining these learning from very small numbers of exemplars. And I think that we are constantly, in an ad hoc way, producing hypotheses and second-guessing what the task is and what the relevant dimensions of variation are. I think this is a key part of our cognitive abilities. Okay. Kazi.
I have 2 points. I'll just make the first one. It's, figuring out what heuristics people are using requires a huge amount of work. So let's take the thing Ted flashed just a little bit, his illusion with the cylinder on it. And there's there are all kinds of Bayesian models about how it works and all the things you do. Well, it turns out if you take the cylinder away, it doesn't change the illusion. It turns out if you take the shadow and make it hard so it looks like paint, it still doesn't change the illusion very much. Okay, very tiny. And so, it's not easy just to take, flows and figure it out. You have to essentially go break up things just like we've always done. Right, so that was one point. The second point, which is more important.
I agree.
The second point, which is more important, since yours was the last talk, and
I agree with what you're about to say as well.
And this is the last question. Is I really think we owe a round of applause to the organizers who put together a really spectacular symposium, which has been incredibly enjoyable. So.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Roland.